Now to our main business of the evening. Martin Goldberg is the principal curator of Medieval Archaeology and History at National Museums of Scotland. He has co-authored important books on early medieval Scotland, individuals, communities and ideas in 2012, and Scotland's earliest silver in 2018. Based on research from the National Museum of Scotland's award-winning partnership with the Glenmorangie Company to explore the material culture of the period AD 300 to 1100. In partnership with Swedish History Museum, he co-curated in 2013 a Vikings exhibition, and with the British Museum an exhibition on Celtic art and identity in Britain. Pertaining to this evening's lecture, Martin is principal investigator on the AHRC-funded Unwrapping Galloway Hoard project in partnership with the University of Glasgow, and he has co-authored with Dr. Mary Davis the book which accompanies the exhibition, which is available on sale at the front. It's a great pleasure I introduce Martin Goldberg.
Thank you very much, and thank you obviously for the invitation to speak to you this evening. As Dave said, I'm very fortunate to be the principal investigator on this AHRC-funded project called Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard. But obviously what I'm going to tell you about is the work of many colleagues, and especially the team at National Museum Scotland, Dr. Mary Davis, my co-author, who was also the conservator working on the hoard for several years, my colleague Dr. Adrian Maldonado, and the textile specialists that we're working with at the University of Glasgow, Susanna Harris and Alexandra Makin. So while we're going through the hoard in great detail, and to push the sort of textile metaphor probably too far, I'd like you to bear in mind three questions. So the first one is, how Viking is the Galloway Hoard? The second one is about motivations, because people always want to know why were hoards buried. It's that final day when something goes into the ground that is always the most difficult to reconstruct. And so we end up telling the same old story over and over again. And this is usually a story about fear of being robbed or fear of death. And so somebody's buried their wealth and they want to come back and get it and reclaim their wealth. But that fear of death turned out to be real. And so the hoard remains buried in the ground until it's discovered by some lucky person in the modern day. Now, this whole thing is pretty much a classic stereotype of the Viking Age. It ties in with our concepts of the Viking Age about monasteries being raided, fear, death, people burying things. But what I would like you to think about while we're looking at this particular hoard is about all the other days that these objects were used, all the lives that they were part of. I would like you to think, what if there were other motivations for collecting these objects together? And if so, can we tell some new stories? And finally, because we're here in the heart of Northumbria, I hope to get to the Northumbrian context for this hoard, but I'm sure that this will come up in discussion anyway. So, the Galloway Hoard was discovered in 2014 by a metal detectorist called Derek McLennan. In the weeks after that, there was a very brief excavation. Derek phoned the Treasure Trove Unit. The Treasure Trove Unit are the people who handle chance finds in Scotland. So Derek phoned them. There was only two of them at this point, and so they work with the local archaeologists if it is a distant part of Scotland away from Edinburgh. And so Derek had been working fields that were owned by the Church of Scotland around a church site called Balmagee in Kirkcudbrightshire. And so the Treasure Trove unit contacted the local archaeologist, who you can see there over the hoard pit, Andrew Nicholson, and he assisted with the excavation. And then there were other resources that came to bear in the weeks after. There was a small excavation to sort of check out the context for the hoard. And it turned out that there was an archaeological context, a building. This is quite rare, and it's something that needs to be investigated more. So then there was a period where the treasure trove process had to kick in, and the point of that process is for the material to be valued and then for it to be allocated to a museum. And so in 2017, we were fortunate enough at National Museum Scotland to be allocated the hoard, and we were given 6 months to raise the £1.98 million for the finder's fee. And so that was quite a challenge, but we did it. There was many donations. There were some very large donations from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, from the Art Fund, and from the Scottish Government. But the really heartening thing for us was the public response to the hoard. And if any of you in this room donated to that particular fundraising exercise, you have my eternal thanks. So from 2018, we were working on the conservation and analysis of the hoard. And this was led by my colleague, Dr. Mary Davis. Now, the goal of this was to deal with a lot of organic material that survived with the gold and the silver, but also with the Scottish Government funding, there was a clause that we would send the hoard out on tour in a couple of years so that other communities around Scotland could get to see it. So this was an exhibition that was planned for 2020, but obviously global events intervened and it was postponed until last year. So the exhibition opened in Edinburgh in May 2021. This coincided with, again, another quite fortunate turn of events where we were successful in getting AHRC funding for a project that would work with the organic materials that survived in the hoard. And for me, that's the real treasure. So there is gold, there is silver, there's an amazing range of objects, but there's also some really important organic materials and especially textiles. And so that's why we're working with the textile specialists and especially my co-investigator, Dr. Susanna Harris. So this is the view on the day. This in the centre is Andrew Nicholson assisting with the excavation of the hoard. A lot of the images from the day come from Martin McSweeney, who was part of the team of metal detectorists that were working the area. And he took a really valuable archive of images that have allowed us to reconstruct a lot of the detail about the hoard and how it was situated in the ground. And so this was the first view. This would be amazing for anybody to find. This was a bundle of arm rings and ingots, 11 arm rings or fragments of, and 11 ingots. And then something slightly unusual, a Christian cross, a pectoral cross that would have been worn on the chest. Here you're just seeing the reverse of it, but you can also see a very fine silver wire spiral chain that would have suspended it round the neck and on the chest. Now this is quite an unusual object. It's not the sort of thing you would normally find in a sort of traditional Viking-age silver bullion hoard. It is silver, so the question is, was it bullion? Was it intended to be melted down, transformed into the types of arm rings and ingots it was found with? So those arm rings give us the sort of essential context. They're a particular type of arm ring called the Hiberno-Scandinavian broadband arm ring, which I'm going to try and say as little as possible for the rest of the talk. The map is courtesy of Dr. Jane Kershaw, And she mapped out for us all of the hoards that have this type of armouring in them. Now, sometimes those armourings are found with coins, and this allows us to give a pretty good date range for the sort of fashion of wearing these armourings, or at least for the fashion of burying these armourings. The date range is roughly 50 years, from about 880 to 930 AD. So there are no coins in the Galloway hoard. At the moment, we're just sort of going roughly for the centre of that date range. For convenience, we say it was buried probably sometime around AD 900. This makes it Scotland's earliest Viking Age hoard. It's the second largest of the hoards that contain this type of armouring. So the dots on the map there are sort of weighted according to size. The largest hoard is a well-known one here from Cuerdale in Lancashire. It weighs 40 kilograms of silver. Ours is the second largest here at Balmagee and only weighs 5 kilograms. So there's quite a difference in size there. But as you can see, ours is still significant compared to the rest. The Hiberno bit in the name comes from what you can see on the map, which is that most of these armourings have been found in Ireland, but there is a good scatter, North Wales, Northern England, and now round the north side of the Irish Sea. And so the Irish Sea is providing this context of Scandinavian incursions in the 9th century AD, and these armourings are part of the new influx of silver that's come in with these Scandinavian invaders and settlers. But to go to that unusual element, this is that pectoral cross when we first had it on display during our fundraising. This is Dr. Mary Davis working on it. She's not super fast. This is a shot taken every minute over the course of an afternoon. So this is her working. It gives you a slightly false impression. This is painstaking, slow work. But what I want you to see is how the cross was being revealed. So that was what we ended up with. This is late Anglo-Saxon style, what was called Trewiddle style metalwork. The dark inlay that you can see is niello, brings out the contrast with the silver of the cross itself. And then there are gold highlights that show different features, particular features. What we have in the arms of the cross are the symbols of the 4 evangelists who wrote the Gospels. At the top is the eagle of St. John. The large image that you can see is the ox of St. Luke. The opposite arm, the lion of St. Mark. And then at the bottom here is St. Matthew. And that was the sort of icon that we've been using for the exhibition as it's been touring Scotland. But that wasn't it. So underneath was a much richer layer of material, and it wasn't recognised at first because there was natural gravel at the base of that top layer with the cross and the armourings and ingots. They ran the metal detector over the bottom of what looked like the pit, over this redeposited natural gravel, and there was still a strong signal. So Andrew Nicholson decided to carry on digging. It was getting late in the day, and I don't think he fully expected, or anyone really expected, what else was underneath. So there is a second deposit of bullion, twice as big as the one above. There is a cluster of arm rings with a wooden box in the middle and some gold objects. And then, most curious of all, this silver gilt decorated vessel. This is a schematic just to show you the relative scale of the objects. This isn't precise, it's not how they were buried, but it shows you the range of material, the top layer with its cross, twice as much bullion, the cluster of arm rings with the gold objects in it, and then the silver gilt vessel with its lid on. So this is the bullion. There are differences with what was above. So there are many more intact arm rings here. there is a different type of ingot. And some of the analysis that we're working on is going to try and figure out why there are these differences, although they do look, I have to say, very similar. But when you start to pull those arm rings out of that pile and bring some order to the chaos, you start to see some important things within this lower bullion deposit. So none of them are shaped as if they have been worn. They may be complete, they may be decorated. Most of them are flat. They've never been bent to be worn around the arm, even if they are decorated. And what you can see here is that some of them have runic inscriptions on them. And so what began to resolve itself was 4 groups where there was a folding pattern that was recognizable on each of these groups. Some were just flat, some had one end tightly pinched, some had 2 ends tightly pinched, and some had this big sort of broad 3/4 fold. Now, most of the arm rings in this lower bullion deposit can be split into one of these 4 groups. And what was really curious was that each one, or in that group, there was always one that had a runic inscription on it. Now, the further curiosity is these are Anglo-Saxon runes, not the Scandinavian runes that we might expect from our stereotypical Viking invaders. So these are Anglo-Saxon name elements in Anglo-Saxon runes. So here we have Till, which might be contemporary names like Tilred or Tilbert. At the bottom here we have Ed, which could be any number of names, Edgar, Edward, Bear, and then we have a really long inscription here on the largest arm ring of the lot, this one here. So this one is twice as big as any of the others, with the longest inscription, but we haven't managed to translate that inscription yet. We can transliterate the runes, but it doesn't quite make sense. So there will be runic experts who will be working with that in the future. And the man that's been working on these inscriptions so far is Dr. David Parsons, and he'll be publishing a Whithorn lecture very soon that deals with these inscriptions and also puts them in the context of a whole series of Anglo-Saxon inscriptions from the 9th century AD that are in this area of Galloway. So 4 groups, and this is one of the questions that people always ask, is how many people are involved? You know, is this the wealth of one person? And actually what we seem to have here for once is very clear evidence that there are at least 4 people involved in the parceling up of this bullion, and presumably 4 people who wanted to come back and quickly separate it. And so they identified their bundles with these folding patterns and with at least an abbreviation of their name, but Anglo-Saxon names, not Scandinavian names. There was also a fragment from the surrounding area. So some elements of the hoard might have been dispersed by the plough, and that was one of the goals of the excavation we did in the weeks afterwards, to make sure that we recovered all the elements of silver. But some of these bits that are from the surrounding area might also be from activity on that site. They might relate to the building that the hoard was buried in. But what's curious about this tiny fragment of hag silver is it has a full Old English name on it, Egbert. And this is a fragment of hack silver that's about 3 centimeters long. And so you can see the E at the beginning here, and then 2 G's, Egbrecht. But they've done the classic thing where they've run out of space at the end, and so they've had to put the T as a tiny little superscript arrow in the top corner. But that tells you that this name was applied to that tiny fragment. It's not broken off a bigger bit. The name was applied to that very small bit. And so with these Old English names, what we get to is that sort of question that I posed at the beginning. How Viking is the Galloway Hoard? And this will come out more and more as we go through it all. I use the example of this arm ring because it's radically different to any of the others that you've seen. This is the only one amongst that group that looks like it's been worn, but it's also the only one that we can recognize as a type from Scandinavia. So the Scandinavian elements are actually quite rare in this group of bullion. So back to our structure. We're going to have a quick look at this smaller bundle of arm rings here. Now this is what it looked like when it came out of the ground. It was lifted along with some of the soil that it was buried with, because there were wooden fragments that were preserved in the middle of this curious bundle of arm rings. And in that wooden, what we think is a box, were 3 gold items. This bird pin here has become one of the sort of icons of the hoard. It's very well represented if you look online. The other thing I would say about it is it has the yellow inlay, and there are characteristics again of late Anglo-Saxon metalwork. So again, we've got that complicating factor. This isn't our stereotype of a Viking hoard. Gold is quite rare. Sometimes the Viking Age is referred to as a silver age because the majority of hoards are silver bullion hoards. So the gold again is a standout material. But the other curious thing about this bundle is that they are all bound together at the back by one of the smaller broadband arm rings. So these arm rings are much more heavily decorated, much more elaborate. They're called ribbon arm rings, so slightly different to the broadband arm rings. This group have had different lives. So some of them are well worn, some of them are freshly made, but they have all been bound together. We can't now separate them because this one is clasping them as a group. There are 4 of them again. So if we're thinking about those 4 people who have some sort of claim of ownership over the rest of the bullion, it's curious that there are 4 here as well. I'm sure the quick amongst you are counting, and it looks like there is 5, but you have to take my word for it. This one here is a massive double arm ring with 2 of the bands and these zoomorphic heads and their tongues binding that particular largest example together. So again, you've got a group of 4 and one that is twice as big as the others. So these aren't necessarily equals. There seems to be somebody consistently who is saying, I'm bigger and better. The comparisons for that type of arm ring aren't particularly apparent. There is the odd thing. So this is the Silverdale hoard, again from Lancashire. And it has another sort of curious arrangement of these larger ribbon arm rings. It has the coins that help us give the date range. And this is currently on display in York if you're interested in seeing it. Other comparisons that we would look for are things like the Vale of York hoard. And what is particularly striking about the Vale of York hoard is it has a vessel that is very similar to that last element that we haven't looked at yet, which we'll move on to. But as well as being a comparison, it's important to bear in mind that there are differences here. So with the Vale of York hoard, it does have a vessel, it does have silver bullion, but all of that bullion was contained within the vessel. Whereas with our hoard, everything that is silver bullion, recognisable as a Viking Age hoard, is outside of the vessel. And what is inside our vessel is really what makes this hoard quite different to any other Viking Age hoard. So there is the vessel. The main thing that you need to note about that is obviously it was wrapped in textiles. And that's where our Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard moniker comes from. So there are 2 layers at least of textile here, some sort of bast fibre on the inside and a wool on the outside that hasn't preserved as well. This is one of the things that obviously we're still working on. The conservation of it is quite in depth. Underneath that lid, the lid had helped create really valuable conditions inside for the preservation of organic material. What we have preserved at the top is a range of beads and pendants. And so some of these are very old. Some of them have no apparent value. This is just a mineral element called a rattlestone. It's got a feature inside it that means when you pick it up and shake it, it rattles. It hasn't been modified by human hand. It's the type of thing that you can pick up in river gravels. So it's just what we would call a curio. The beads are the types of beads that would normally be found in Anglo-Saxon graves 2 centuries before the Galloway hoard was buried. So these look like antiques. They look like heirlooms, things that have been handed down. One of the goals of our research is to try and reconstruct these object biographies. So some of these objects are quite complex. So this is both a bead and a pendant. There is a broken bead in the middle of this fitting, this mount, and through the hole in the bead there is a pendant fitting and also a perforated coin. The perforated coin is Coenwulf of Mercia, who died around 820 AD. So this is a coin that is several generations old by the time the Galloway hoard is buried. So again, it's that indication that these things are old, they're cared for, they've been transformed in some way, and they've also been carefully wrapped. So that one in particular gives us the best evidence that each one of these items have been wrapped. And when you go back and look at this original image, you can see that there are tiny textile fragments everywhere covering these glass beads. But the textile is best preserved where it's in contact with metal. So the glass hasn't preserved the textiles as well. So one of the goals of the project is to examine those textiles, to learn what we can from them. There was already a radiocarbon date done from the wool that was wrapping, the outer wrapping of the vessel. And this gave quite a surprising date, AD 670 to 780. So that is at least 100 years before we think the hoard was buried, possibly 200 years. And again, it gives you that idea of antiquity, of things being older or several centuries old by the time that they're buried, with the silver bullion that has that much more contemporary economic value in the late 9th century AD. So underneath the beads and the pendants, there was a silver penannular brooch hoop, and under that, a group of Anglo-Saxon metalwork. Again, this is something unusual for Scotland. We don't normally find this sort of thing north of the border. Disc brooches, these would be the first group, the first examples for Scotland, but also the first sort of collection of them together. So there are pairs of brooches here, different designs. There are obviously relationships between them. There is an unusual type of brooch that we're calling face brooches that are unique to the Galloway hoard, so they're not known about within the wider corpus of Anglo-Saxon metalwork. And there are also these funny hinged straps. So we have 5 plates here, 4 hinges holding them together, and the only way to really describe it is like a watch strap. You know, the hinges allow it to go around a wrist. Presumably they're worn in some way. They're an item of dress. They are decorated in very similar style to the Anglo-Saxon cross, and one of the interesting things that we'll hopefully get to do is compare those styles of objects, the various Anglo-Saxon pieces of metalwork that are in this hoard, but also the other materials. So if we think back to the bird pin and its Trewiddle style decoration, this rock crystal sphere has what we can only describe as a cross that is very similar to the cross in the top layer of the hoard, and the Anglo-Saxon beads that look like heirlooms. So there's a whole range of material here to work with, the type of material that we wouldn't normally find in a Viking-age hoard, and certain that we don't normally find in Scotland. So adjacent to that is where we get the really complex organic and inorganic bundles. And these presented the greatest challenge to the conservation process. And so we've been taking our time with them, and that's why we were fortunate to get the AHRC funding and work with the textile specialists at the University of Glasgow, because they can really help us understand this material. So this is what they looked like when they came out of the vessel. They were unpacked in laboratory conditions by AOC Archaeology under the supervision of Historic Environment Scotland. And this is how they came to us in 2018. They were kept in these conservation slings so that Mary Davis and the textile specialists could begin working on them. You can see little hints, tantalizing glimpses of gold, which I'll try and tell you a bit more about shortly. There's an X-ray that shows you the shape of what was concealed within this bundle. So we think that this is a silk-lined pouch. This would be Scotland's, again, oldest example of silk that we know of. But also there is leather wrapping that, and there are elements of linen in there as well. So a complex group of organic materials. But the X-ray showed us that there was also quite a complex gold object in there. And we recognize this as a rock crystal jar, which I'll tell you more about soon. The other X-ray of what we call the silk cord bundle showed what looks like a set of bagpipes, but it's not. These are a type of gold mount that have a long socket on them. And again, we'll come to those in a moment. But that's the glimpse that we had when we put the exhibition on last year. Underneath that, there is more. So the complex bundles are removed. There are a lot of detached fragments of textile that we have to work with. So we need to identify which element of the wrapping that these came from. There is a really large gold pendant at the bottom. There's those two funny hinge straps. And then probably most curious of all, two balls of dirt. So that big gold pendant, it's about the size of my thumb. This is not a gemstone. That's one of the really curious things about this. The X-ray showed that it's actually a metamorphic, it's a schist. So not the type of stone you would normally expect to be encased in this type of elaborate gold work. It has this funny pyramid base on it with tiny gold clasps. Now we haven't done this, but those gold clasps would allow you to unhook that pyramid cap, and you would be able to slide out that black, carefully shaped quadrangular stone. Now, my colleague, Dr. Mary Davis, examined the surface of this stone very carefully, and it has streaks of different types of precious metals on it, especially gold. And so what we think this is a touchstone. So it's something that a metalworker or a trader in precious metals would use to assess the quality of those metals. So you take the metal and you streak it on this very even black surface, and with a carefully trained eye you would recognize the quality of the precious metals, and it would then assist you in the valuing and the trading of those. But those, so that we know that these touchstones exist. Sometimes they are pendant whetstones, occasionally they're called. This has a hole at the top in the gold mount, so a pendant fitting, but it also has the same elements of silk cord that were in that bundle above it, so it must relate to that bundle in some way. But yes, a touchstone, I've never seen one with this level of elaboration. So again, it looks like something that's treasured, something that has been carefully encased, almost like a relic, but also something that occasionally could be used for its original function again. So we worked on that. That is on display in the exhibition. You can read a bit more about it in the book if you choose. One of the real mysteries for us, though, were these dirt balls. That's a close-up. They're about the size of a Malteser. what are they doing there? They're with this amazing collection of material, gold, silk that will have travelled thousands of miles to get to Britain. What would be the point of two small balls of dirt in amongst these riches? I can only assume, or it is an assumption of mine, that they had value as well. And if we're thinking about materials in this vessel that didn't have natural intrinsic value, things like the glass beads or that funny rattlestone, then we can start to get into the mindset of why these were part of that collection as well. So you can see how they were formed. They're almost like kids would do with plasticine. Two sausages rolled out, interlinked, and roughly made into balls. When Mary started to examine them, she noticed that there were elements, very tiny, microscopic elements of gold all over the surface of this dirt, and occasional unusual organic elements, so plant matter, bits of what looked like burnt bone. So one of our big questions was, is the gold in particular secondary? Is it from the gilded objects that they're with? Has it been transferred onto the surface of the dirt? And so we were working with colleagues at the British Museum who helped us CT scan these dirt balls. And this is Dr. Dan O'Flynn, who was the technical specialist who did this for us. There's Mary looking at the CT scans. So as we sliced through the dirt balls, what we could see was everywhere the slices we took, there was a scatter of gold. And so what that tells us is the gold was present when those bits of dirt were rolled out and interlinked and rolled. They're not secondary surface application. They were part of the environment where these dirt balls were formed. Now, there are two possible explanations. With the touchstone there as a sort of metal worker's tool or a metal trader's tool, there could be a sort of practical explanation, which is if you were working with gold and you wanted to gather up microscopic elements of it from your workshop, you would maybe clean your surface with those dirt balls, and try and pick up the dirt that way and then extract it later on. And that's certainly a possibility. But the other intriguing thing about these dirt balls, and particularly the other elements that are in there, the shattered bone, and also the context of what they're with, what looks like other relic material, other antiquities. I was looking for other examples of what this could be, and there is a tradition in medieval Christianity of bringing back earthen relics from sacred places, so areas where you might have gilded objects. It was sort of the easiest thing to bring back with you, an essence of the place you had done pilgrimage to. The comparison that I have found is in the Vatican collection, where there is a series of earth relics, and by the paleography of the labels that go with the earth relics, they can be dated to 650 to 900 AD. And these earth relics, for the people in Rome, what they were looking for were the essence of the Holy Land. So these labels tell us that they are coming from Bethlehem, the banks of the River Jordan, the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre, places that Christians were interested in, but whose access had become limited due to the Islamic conquests. So there is a tantalizing possibility here that we might have something similar. We might have some of these earth relics. I'm not quite sure how we will ever prove it, but the scientific techniques that we can use to explore things like this are improving all the time, so we remain hopeful. Dan also helped us with our first unwrapping, which was looking at the vessel. So the vessel is still wrapped. We didn't put it on display in our touring exhibition, but using modern technology, we've been able to show people what it looked like under those textile wrappings. So this is Dan taking a series of 360-degree X-ray slices through the vessel, and then a technician called Steve Day managed to reconstruct it for us and reconstruct it in a way that you could then see the decorated surface of the vessel. Now, we thought we knew what this vessel should be because of the comparison of things like the Vale of York hoard. The Vale of York hoard has been interpreted as a Carolingian cup because the decoration on it can be linked to Carolingian manuscripts of the 9th century AD. That isn't what we saw on ours. So, the first thing to note is that the base and the whole design is sort of built around these 4 medallions. And here you can see the medallions sprouting out from the base. At the base of each of those medallions is a triple-pointed crown, what would be referred to as an Eastern crown. You can just see it there, the hairs at the bottom of the scan. And sprouting out from that, what look like 2 wings. Sprouting out from that, some peculiar foliage with some very ugly-looking creatures in amongst it. But with the eye of faith, you can see spots and stripes. And so we think that these are representations of leopards and tigers. And the central motif seems to be this feature here, again with that triple-pointed crown poking out of it. So that design and metalwork was not what we were expecting. And it's very similar to what you see here, which is a late Sasanian bowl from the 6th to 7th century AD. The Sasanian Empire was based in what is now Iran. So this is Central Asian metalwork, something quite different. But you can see the quadripartite sort of design, see those loose foliage elements. And here there are various scenes that are related to Sasanian iconography, and particularly the Zoroastrian religion that was the state religion of the Sasanian Empire. Here we see somebody sacrificing over a fire altar, which was one of the central icons of the Zoroastrian religion. And so I think that is what we have here, one of these dished fire altars, stylized flames and a crown emerging from the flames. If we look at Sasanian iconography as it appears on coinage, there is always the emperor's head on one side. The emperor is usually wearing some sort of winged crown. And on the other side of their coinage is always a fire altar of many different shapes and sizes, often with very stylized flames on top of it, sometimes with the emperor's head crowned in amongst the flames. So there are subtle links between this iconography and what we see on the Galloway Hoard vessel. Again, looking at elements of Zoroastrian religion, this is an ossuary from near Samarkand that has a Zoroastrian fire stand or fire altar as its central icon, with the vegetal motifs coming out the side, stylized flames on the top. I first found this during the pandemic, and the masks really threw me for a while, but we don't have time to go into that. So this takes us out to quite an unexpected place, out to Central Asia. But some of the silver that we find in the Viking Age, particularly the coinage that appears in hoards in Britain and Ireland, is being minted as far away as Samarkand on the Silk Roads. And there is a context for this. Even in our hoard, there is a context because we have silk. So there are material connections that we can make. Yes, it was incredibly unexpected. And there will be some debate about the identification of this vessel. But Barry Yeager, who is the former curator at the British Museum, who was writing up the Vale of York cup, he had already pointed out the similarities in form and in decoration with Central Asian metalwork. Barry only published this in 2020, and I only got my X-ray scan in 2020. But I think it was quite unexpected for him in particular. So he had suggested this connection, but what we seem to have is an actual object now in northern Britain that can actually make that iconographic connection and the connections in form and decoration. So that allowed us to create a 3D model. So this is a sort of digital render, photorealistic of what it looked like. The vessel itself is still wrapped. Mary's working on it at the moment. But what it gives you is the ability to represent it in our exhibition. So it buys us time to do justice to the textiles, these very rare survivals that are wrapping it. And there's my colleague Adrian showing you for scale. This is only 10 centimetres wide at the mouth. It's a tiny vessel with the lid creating the conditions for this exceptional preservation inside, and the careful packing that went into all of these different objects. So the project that we're working on at the moment, while the rest, so 97% of the hoard has been on tour. It's been in Kirkcudbright for 9 months, which is the museum closest to where it was discovered. It's been in Aberdeen for the last couple of months. And we'll be putting updates on the website if you want to learn more as we go through our project. But the things that we've been working on that we've managed to reveal so far are interesting details about those two bundles. So the silk cord bundle, we've the type of object that this is supposed to be is largely, the interpretation is based on the Alfred jewel, which is a reused rock crystal with an inscription round the edge. It says, "Alfred had me made," and what I think is a secondary reuse of one of these socketed mounts on the end of it. And these have been interpreted as manuscript pointers. But our bundle, we think, tells us something different about this group of objects. So wherever these long sockets are, what we were hoping to find were elements of these silk cords in those long sockets. If they were manuscript pointers, they would have bits of wood or bits of bone in them to use as manuscript pointers. But this looks more like an item of dress. What you can see here is the X-ray showing up the gold thread that's in some of this silk, so really quite elaborate silk cord. And there's the three objects revealed, really quite curious looking. But the interesting details that we wanted to find were there. The long sockets have little rivets in them that were holding in bits of the silk cord. So we think the silk cord would have looped in and out of this middle one that has 4 sockets on it and back round to the terminal here. So to me, this either looks like a girdle or a belt or an item of dress of some sort, and we'll be working on the reconstructions of that. Again, it has to link in some way to that large pendant whetstone, the touchstone, but it too had the element of silk cord in there, so we'll try and figure out how that works together. The rock crystal jar, one of the things that was really tantalizing was we also CT scanned that while it was in its bundle. Let me see if I can get this to work. This is a screenshot of what we saw when we were first looking at it. And what you can see here is the decoration on the bottom. So square base, round top, spout. It's got a hollow middle. But what really shocked us was it looks like asymmetric decoration on the bottom. And this was something intriguing that we had to wait a while to figure out. But when Mary unwrapped it with the help of the textile specialists, you could see the amazing detail of this rock crystal for the first time. So this is a very hard material, very difficult to carve, but the carving is consistent. There are these lobes. The gold meshwork wraps around the carved surface. Now, the thing that bothered me about this was to me, it made a lot more sense upside down. These look like the lobes of a Corinthian column capital. And so I was thinking it was something like this. And it makes sense of the square, what is now the square base of the jar would then connect to the architecture above. The round top makes more sense as a column attachment. I had no idea where to look for something like this. But again, the Vatican collection contains a whole series of rock crystal columns that are remnants that have survived. Well, the only context that we have for one of them is from an early Christian catacomb from the 2nd century AD. So again, this looks like an object that is possibly centuries old before it is transformed into this gold-wrapped jar. So the other thing to note is that all of these columns have a drilled core right down the middle. And I think this is so that you can take the different components of the column and piece it together with something holding them together in the middle. But that central core is what has allowed our rock crystal to be reused as a jar, or you might think of it as a very small vial. So here you can see it in relation to my hand. It's a tiny little thing. It's the sort of size of a perfume jar, and it would have held a very small amount of liquid in that drilled core. The core lines up with the gold spout there, but Mary's conservation work revealed that asymmetric decoration on the base, which is actually an inscription executed in gold filigree, and gives us another name to conjure with, Hewald. But not only his name, it tells us that he was a bishop and he had this object made. And so this, again, is another example of not only the ecclesiastical context. So we've got our Christian cross in the top layer. We've potentially got relics. We've got another relic of ancient Rome transformed into a jar by Anglo-Saxon goldwork, probably in the 9th century AD. And we've got another name to add to our Northumbrian context. So I'm going to call it a day there. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, a lot to take in. I welcome your question and comments. Thank you very much.